It's great to have the opportunity to share with you this research that I prepared to share at the United Nations CSW conference to be held in New York last month, which was canceled like every other major event around the world. Such cancellation may be effective in stopping the spread of the coronavirus, yet it will do little to reverse the grave event that is happening worldwide, an event that the world is not prepared for, the coming demographic winter. In our research and production of 4 documentaries, Demographic Winter, The Decline of the Human Family, Demographic Bomb, Demography as Destiny, and the New Economic Reality, Demographic Winter, and our latest documentary, Outcomes, The Family and Faith Factors, our production team interviewed many scholars, demographers, economists, sociologists, and civic leaders from around the world who gave evidence of major demographic changes that were taking place worldwide. We call this new season of change a demographic winter. So what is demographics? It is a study of the statistical data that makes up a population, its size, its growth, its decline, its birth rates, the age and gender makeup of a population, etc. So does the demographics of a country really matter? In 2011, I was in New York attending the United Nations Commission on Social Development, and to give an introduction screening at the UN Millennial Plaza of our latest documentary, The New Economic Reality, Demographic Winter. It was a beautiful morning in March as I was walking to the UN Plaza. The sun rays was just starting to peek around these giant buildings of Manhattan when I caught a glimpse of ships coming into the New York harbor, wondering if my European ancestors may have come through those same portals at a time in history when Americans understood the necessity of immigrants as needed for a country's continued growth and economic prosperity. In that film introduction, I shared the words of Phil Longman, a Washington, D.C. demographer and author of the book, The Empty Cradle, who stated that demographics may be the greatest predictor of the fate and future of society in the 21st century. Now, many are not aware that one of the most ominous dramas of modern times is quietly unfolding, as the world is headed towards a demographic tipping point, which threatens serious social and economic consequences. The world today has experienced a 50% decline in birth rates over the last 50 years, leaving over 70 countries around the world that will not replace the previous generation. If a country is to replace the previous generation, it takes a birth rate of 2.1 children to replace every 2 individuals, and all of Europe, for example, is only at 1.38. If a country's birth rate declines to 1.1, it puts the country in jeopardy of serious free fall, which is almost impossible to get turned around. The United Nations Population Division estimates that by the year 2050, that there will be 248 million fewer children under the age of 5 than there are at present. So what does this changing demographic mean for society? So what lessons maybe that we could learn from history? In the study of the decline and fall of the Greek Empire, Polybus in 150 BC stated, "Nowadays, all over Greece, in a general matter, such depopulation that towns are deserted and fields lie fallow. Although this country has not been ravaged by war epidemics, the cause of this harm is evident. The people, if they marry, will not bring up children as they ought. It is in this way that the scourge before us has rapidly developed." Shortly thereafter, Greece was annexed as a Roman state in 146 BC. Following by the fall of the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire entered a period of decline in which they lost 40% of their population, dropping from 47 million down to 29 million. We refer to this period of decline as the Dark Ages. In our interview with Dr. Gary Becker, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics, he stated that population reduction enters us into unknown terrain. Adam Smith, the greatest economist, said that economic prosperity comes from population growth, and depression is associated with declining populations. This could lead to very serious consequences. In 2005, in the introduction of our first documentary, Demographic Winter, The Decline of the Human Family, we interviewed a German demographer who informed us in Germany that their government had to close 280 schools. And the reason given was that there were not enough children coming up through the ranks, leaving them to wonder how they were going to man their farms and factories in the future. They understood that due to their aging population and low birth rates, that they would be experiencing a major labor shortage, which would mean a loss of government revenues, human capital, as needed to become a great and prosperous nation. They understood that if they really wanted to grow their workforce, what they would need to do is open their borders to all comers and let immigrants in which Germany took in approximately 2 million Syrians as needed to keep their industries operating. But that has an effect too, given, it really does have an effect on the changing of your culture. Nobel Prize winning economist Gary Becker, along with Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt from Harvard University, in our interviews with them, they pointed out how important human capital is for a country's continued prosperity.
Why is productivity important for economies?
Growth in an economy is based on productivity advance, which is the engine, fundamentally the engine of growth in any economy.
If human capital growth is essential for modern economic growth, how is human capital impacted by fertility decline?
Well, it's hard to sustain economic growth without human capital increases. And so you can increase human capital either by getting everybody way, way educated and improving each person's productive capacity, or you can have more people. There's really only two ways to do it.
The way we measure economic progress is through what we call the gross domestic product. Now, many people don't realize that when the gross domestic product grows, most of that growth is population growth. Economists define gross domestic product as the number of people, workers specifically, times their productivity.
Current demographic trends in all rich countries mean that GDP growth won't come anymore from a growing number of workers. For example, the number of U.S. workers is projected to be stagnant for at least the next 2 decades. And Europe has an even worse problem with its working age population.
Subreplacement fertility a generation and more ago means that the working age population, age 15 to 64, is going to be slowing and then peaking and then declining more or less indefinitely as far as the demographer's eye can see.
So if the working age population is shrinking, how can we increase human capital?
Well, if you have fewer and fewer workers, each one of them has to get that much more productive in order to even keep the economy from shrinking, right? So in the context of flat or falling population, we have a much greater challenge just to keep the current standard of living what it is. That's not controversial at all. That's just economics 101.
Without more people, productivity increases and economic increases can only come from our working either harder or smarter. Is this a problem?
What we in the West have been doing is putting all of our eggs in the human capital basket and saying we're going to increase the productivity of each person and letting the expansion of population part just go down the tubes and not even pay any attention to it. Well, we've come to the end of the road on that. We can't keep going down that particular path.
So if a country has fallen off course, how do they get back on track? Dr. Joseph Chamy, director of the Population Division at the United Nations, in a talk given to world leaders, expressed concerns that it was the developed nations of the world that were experiencing the greatest decline in birth rates, stating that the developed world depopulation would have an immediate negative impact on the global economy, as developed countries have a particularly important role because they provide a great deal of the economic leadership. They are basically the producer nations, the consumer nations, and the donor nations. Even in the United States, the fertility birth rate fell below replacement in 2017. The findings show that as the world becomes more secular, then the opportunity to turn around the fertility diminishes. For it is only people of faith that are really having children, as needed to replace the previous generation. These two charts show huge decline in birth rates in both Europe and in the Asian nations. One of the most telling stories is that of Singapore. Singapore implemented draconian two-child policy decades ago, where the government dictated that the whole family would be punished if the family had a third child. The punishment would be a loss of all their social welfare benefits, including free education. So how did the two-child policy work in Singapore? Well, not well, because even today they haven't been able to turn it around. The data shows that in 1962, Singapore birth rate fell from 5.21 for every two individuals, okay, to 20 years later, in 1982, it had dropped to 1.74 to replacement fertility. And in 2017, it dropped to 1.16. That is a 42% below replacement fertility rates. In March of 2019, while in Verona, Italy, attending the World Congress of Families 13, where hundreds of delegates came together from 45 different countries from around the world. At this World Congress, I was asked to speak on the chilling effects that this demographic winter would have on countries worldwide. Following my speech, a lady approached me. She introduced herself as president of the Institute of European Studies. She told me that after being granted permission, in which we granted her permission to translate our documentary, Demographic Winter, The Decline of the Human Family, that they did translate our documentary into 60 different languages, stating that the documentary Demographic Winter was well known now in Europe, and that even the Pope had recently commented on it in his speech given. So I decided to search online, and I found this world news headline which stated, "The Pope warns of a deepening demographic winter." It read, "The Pope reminded his congregation in the chapel at Saint Marta that the very first commandment that God gave man is to be fruitful and to multiply, stating that what it comes down to is that of selfishness. Commenting that aging societies like Europe face a great demographic winter, and what it is needed is more immigration. Without immigration, the Pope added, Europe will become empty, calling it a grave disease. Today, Italy is experiencing these population declines. For the fifth straight year, they have seen major decline in their population. They only have 67 births for every 100 deaths. In 2019, their deaths now exceed births by 212,000. Let's step back in history to kind of gain an understanding of how this demographic dilemma came about. Interwoven into the tapestry of human history as part of this fabric of academic thought in the 1800s was this idea that the world was overpopulated. Charles Dickens, in the early 1800s, wrote a timeless story, The Christmas Carol, where Ebenezer Scrooge made this statement: If they'd rather die, then let them do so and decrease the world's surplus population. That idea was made famous at that time by Thomas Malthus, an English economist who wrote and published in 1798 an essay entitled The Principles of Population, where he claimed that food production cannot keep pace with population growth. This scarcity mentality towards population growth was then handed down through the centuries to our day, as it was once again echoed by Paul R. Ehrlich, a Stanford professor who in 1968 published his runaway best-selling book, The Population Bomb, where he stated that by the 1980s, hundreds of millions of people would starve to death due to the fact that of a lack of resources as needed to sustain continued population growth. But did that ever happen? Do we have a lack of resources? However, this unsustainability idea was accepted by many scholars and shared through the centuries to our schools and universities, making it pretty politically incorrect for teachers or professors or even politicians to talk about the importance that continued population growth meant to the economic survival of a nation. For perspective on whether this world is really overcrowded, let me share with you just this hypothetical example. Let's assume that we could take the entire population of the world, which is now just over 7 billion, and give every man, woman, and child a quarter acre of land, which would give a family of 4 an entire acre of ground to live and to cultivate. You could place the entire population of the world in just one country, Brazil, leaving approximately a sixth of Brazil in open space, leaving the rest of South America totally uninhabited, not to mention the rest of the planet. I mean, all of Central and North America, all of Europe, Africa, China, India, Russia, and every other continent and island of the sea totally uninhabited. And we ask ourselves, the question, what, we really can't sustain ourselves? In 1999, on my way back from the World Congress on Families which was being held in Geneva, Switzerland, I was just finishing reading a book entitled The Great Boom Ahead by Harry Dent, a Harvard economist and Bain Capital consultant, who claimed that through the study of demographics, that his organization could predict the future prosperity of a country, predicting in 1992 that the United States would see unprecedented growth due to the 81 million baby boom generation. So has the baby boom generation been a plus for America? After World War II, as the American soldier returned home, they started producing babies, which produced the largest generation of births in history. As this baby boom generation reached their peak spending years, between 31 and 50 years of age, the U.S. stock market soared, resulting in 50 years of great prosperity. Harry Dent, an investment advisor, pointed out that if you want to grow your wealth, then one should invest in companies that catered to these 81 million baby boom generation that was moving through the economy. So what is happening in America today, and where are they? And what's the picture? There is an unprecedented demographic shift that is taking place. The baby boom generation found here in America is now entering their retirement years. Within 5 years, by the year 2025, the United States will see a major demographic shift take place. There will be 65 million seniors over the age of 65 and only 58 million children under the age of 13. This is an economic model that is not sustainable. A good example from history of what happens when a country stops having children is that of Japan. After World War II, Japan had all their women in the workforce for their war machine. After World War II, they encouraged all the women to remain in the workforce, to clean up the ashes of destruction, to really grow their economy. Thus, Japan didn't have a baby boom generation like America. However, their economy grew for a short while during the 70s and 80s because they had everybody in the workforce, causing many economists to claim that maybe this is a model that we should consider. Forgetting, however, the important role that mothers play in the delivery and development of a child, and how important that is for a country. Today, due to the lack of children, Japan, the country of the rising sun, is now setting. Japan was one of the first countries in the world to experience a major birth dearth. After 2 good decades, their dearth of children and aging population has weighed down their economy. To bolster their economy, they have turned to quantitative easing, which is the printing of money, which is really no fix at all. Before the Japanese government got heavily into quantitative easing in 1990 through 2005, their stock market lost 70% of their value, and their real estate values plummeted by 60%. Japan's birth dearth and now aging population has led to staggering national debt. Japan's national debt exceeded 230 times their GDP. As compared to Greece, for example, it was 177 times their GDP. And we all know really what happened to Greece for a while. There was a run on the banks, and Germany and the European Union had to step in to provide some rescue for them. The countries that are really feeling the chilling effect of this demographic winter of low birth rates and rapidly aging populations are the same countries which lead the world in the amount of national debt as measured as a percentage of their GDP. This correlation really needs to be understood by policymakers worldwide. Now, this chart shows that the United Nations, it was actually prepared by them and Eurostat EU 27, showing population projections, showing that most of the developed nations of the world will soon be experiencing population declines. Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt from Harvard University pointed out that with low birth rates, the reason why many of the nations have not experienced population decline until just recently is that the elderly populations have just been living a lot longer than ever before in history. For example, Japan's life expectancy is in 2016 was 74.8 years of age. So does policies change societies? Another good example of how policies can really have an effect on a society is that of China and their one-child policy. After 3 generations, this policy has led to what demographers refer to as a 4-2-1 scenario, where one child is left to care for 2 parents that are going into retirement and 4 grandparents which are in retirement, leaving just 1 person in the family to pull the wagon while 6 are at the retirement age and looking to ride. This is an economic model that will not sustain itself. Today, China is feeling the effects of this one-child policy, as their economy in 2015 took a huge downturn. Their company stocks plummeted by 38% in just a matter of a few weeks, a loss of over $3.25 trillion. And it has really had a difficult time struggling to get back. Dr. Nicholas Eberstadt pointed out that selective sex abortions is so widespread, especially in China, but is affecting the entire world, that it will affect the composition of the entire human species. That is especially true in China, as it is estimated that there will be over 55 million men that will not be able to get married because there is not enough women coming up through the ranks. So what kind of implications will this have for societies worldwide? And how will this affect China? The projections show that by 2030, a quarter of China's population will be over the age of 60. China's elderly population increased from 13% in 2010 to 18% in 2019. If present trends continue, China will lose over 20 million workers by mid-century. This loss of workers will mean less government revenues, increased taxes, increased amount of the national debt, and due to pensions and health care costs that will soar. What has been really concerning to Beijing is that China's ability to compete in the global market, given the fact that they really relied on their large, low-cost, high-yield workforce that they will not have going forward. At the World Congress on Families 9, held in Salt Lake City, I was scheduled to conduct a morning session. While driving to that session, I received a phone call from my oldest son, Reed, who was living in Shanghai, China. He informed me that the Chinese government had just announced that they would be lifting the one-child policy, allowing a couple to have a second child. So at the World Congress on Families, I read from this Chinese newspaper, the Shanghai List, this statement. Recently, more and more critics have begun to worry about China's low birth rate and rapidly aging population. Leaders, after outlining the benefits of a two-child policy, stated that they could not sit idle on this demographic time bomb any longer. We were excited to hear this news because we joined our voice with others and sending back some messages to the government officials. We actually went into China and even filmed our documentary, Demographic Bomb, Demography is Destiny. We interviewed many scholars also around the world who opined to the fact that China's one-child policy would lead to serious economic consequences for their country. What China's government leaders needed to understand is the economic connection that this would have for the development of their nation. In 2014, I was also in Moscow as part of the World Congress on Families Organizing Committee. Russia today is also experiencing huge declines in their population. It is estimated that if their present trends continue, that Russia's population will shrink from 141 million to below 100 million by 2050. Father Dmitry, that you see in the picture here, he informed me that if I ought to consider staying on and taking a road trip with him across Russia, and he would take me to towns and villages across Russia that had been totally deserted. Russia would like immigrants, but they are a more closed society, and they really do need an increase in workforce as needed to man their farms and factories going forward. And yet they open their borders and people don't come. So how did Russia's decline in population happen? Well, Russia was one of the first to legalize abortions in 1922. And as such, they were one of the first countries to experience a population decline. Even with these declines, many of the policymakers really hadn't woken up to the fact that their deaths and abortions were at 4.1 million, where their life births were only at 1.9 million. So what can be done to reverse the effects of these demographic winters that some countries have been facing and experiencing for a good number of years? Russia's brochure makes this statement: strengthening the family is key to overcoming this demographic winter. They're waking up to that effect. Policymakers need to wake up to that fact that without strong families and more family-friendly policies, that their country is going down the wrong road. As there are many policies that are very detrimental to motherhood, marriage, faith, and family for a nation. After Father Dmitry, shared, some of his thoughts in the conference that I was there to experience, he quoted the words of Prime Minister Putin, who, after coming to an understanding of the severity of the Russian situation, stated that the falling population poses a dire threat to their country's very existence. Russia also pointed out on this brochure that what is really central is that of family, because it's family that solves so many of the social ills that are out there today, not government. So when policymakers come to understand the important role that children, marriage, faith, and family play in the development of a country, then they will elevate the value that they place on children, marriage, faith, and family. And that they will put in place more family-friendly policies and laws that's needed to really fortify the natural family. A demographic summit was held at the University of Moscow, where policies that came out of that demographic summit resulted in the passing of many new initiatives in support of the family, such as a government-paid 6-month maternity leave, a cash payment equivalent to 7,000 euros given to a family on their second child's 3rd birthday. And so they needed to make it to that 3rd birthday. A monthly subsidy of food and daycare services were provided. Upon a family having a 3rd child, they were entitled to land ownership, a farm, or house subsidies or rent. They also placed a sin tax on those performing abortions and those having abortions, along with placing major restrictions on abortions after 12 weeks. When policymakers come to understand the economic connections, then they do elevate the value that they place on children, marriage, faith, and family in society. So what is the economic solutions? Is strengthening and fortifying the family the answer? Yes, you got to think so.
Tradition holds that throughout history, the family has been the fundamental unit of society. It was within newly formed families that a majority of men and women met their most basic needs. It was within families that the next generation was born and raised. Groups of families became cultures, and combined cultures became civilizations. And human civilizations were sustainable because at their foundations were families, which could replenish themselves as older generations passed away. But what if, at the very time that our entire civilization no longer values families, we begin to realize how important they really are. And what if the traditions about families were correct?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the first statement ever issued by the United Nations.
It's a document that was signed by all the countries in the world essentially at that time, and it was non-controversial.
You'll see that it says the following: the family is the natural, fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by the state.
In 1948, families were seen as so fundamental to society that major nations of the world vowed to protect them. But by 1968, many of us had begun to assume that there would always be plenty of others. In fact, too many others, willing to marry and to bear and raise children. But were too many children born?
Another changing demographic that needs to be understood by policymakers is that young adults from around the world in their prime childbearing years are less likely to get married and have children. The research shows statistically that there is an increased number of babies being born outside wedlock. The findings show that children being born and reared without a mother and father in the home is more likely to try drugs, to live in poverty, to be abused, to be sexually active, to drop out of school, to need daycare services, to need government welfare services, showing that family fragmentation comes at a huge cost to governments worldwide, which raises the question, if having both a mother and father in the home is the ideal, shouldn't we as a society be reaching for that ideal? In May of 2017, while in Budapest, Hungary, speaking at the World Congress of Families 11, the Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, stated that their country had experienced a 10% decline in populations over the last 10 years, expressing his concern that the effects that it would have on their economy, stating that the Hungarian government was prepared to implement new and aggressive family policies, which would hopefully encourage strong and larger families. In the session in which I spoke in Budapest, I turned to the cabinet minister, stating that we had coined the word demographic winter, and as such was using it to strengthen and fortify the natural family worldwide, and that other countries around the world were starting to use demographic winter as a government initiative and was funding it accordingly. Very similar to what the progressive left has really used global warming in addressing many things, from population control measures and really pushing that we should have less carbon footprints to pollute Mother Earth. Following the World Congress in Budapest, Naomi, one of the organizers of the World Congress of Families in Budapest, emailed me and let me know that the government had decided to have a demographic summit. And what came out of that summit was that the minister that I had visited with had announced that they would be funding Demographic Winter as a government initiative. Now, everyone has defining events in their lives that inspires their own personal research. For me, it was in 1999. I was attending the World Congress on Families II, which was held at the United Nations Assembly Hall in Geneva, Switzerland, where in attendance was approximately 3,200 delegates from 64 countries who came together to discuss and deliberate on the fate of the future of the family worldwide. At this World Congress, we were working on a declaration for the family, very similar to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Family Proclamation. The goal was to have unanimous consensus on this family declaration to the world, to be presented at the United Nations and to be shared with nations worldwide. After several sessions of debate, it looked like that we were not going to be able to get a consensus on this family declaration to the world. It really looked doomed. When Dr. Rabbi Lapin a Jewish rabbi, stood up. He had just finished addressing the delegation, but here he stood up again, and he walked to the pulpit and invited the Arab delegation to come and join him on the stand. So the whole Arab delegation rose and walked up to the stand in their white robes from their head to the ground. And they surrounded this Jewish rabbi there at the pulpit. And then he went on to say, there are not a lot of things that the Arab nations and the Jewish people can agree upon. But when it comes to the importance of family and the value and blessing that children, marriage, and family play for the future of society, this is something that we can come to an agreement on. And with that, they lined up across the stage and they grasped, each other's hands, and then they raised their hands like this in the air. And they asked that a vote be taken. And a vote was taken, and it unanimously passed. The closing ceremonies featured the Osmond family that performed, as a family on the stage. And then everybody waltzed out to the balconies there and to watch a beautiful fireworks show over Geneva Bay. Now, truly, the family is the most fundamental unit of society and is worthy of protection by the state. In closing, I would like to just share with you a little video clip of our latest documentary, Outcomes of Family and Faith Factors. In this documentary, we interviewed many scholars who shared compelling research that shows the vital role that marriage, faith, and family play in the development of a child, showing that if you want the highest outcomes possible for a child, then you have to add a spiritual element to that equation. The findings show that if a child receives a formal spiritual instruction on a weekly basis, then it will elevate that child to a whole higher level of competency, showing the powerful influence that faith and family structure plays in the development of a child and ultimately in the development of a nation. I'll share you this little clip from our documentary, Outcomes, the Family and Faith Factors.
One way to strengthen the family is to strengthen faith. I think that the principal force undergirding the family in society is faith. It's faith that validates the family. It's faith that teaches people the importance of putting others before self.
Well, we look at the international data. Women who worship God weekly are the most fertile women in the world, much more likely to have children than those who never worship, who only have about 1/3 the number of children on average.
It's faith that teaches children and adults of our responsibilities to society, our responsibilities to past generations, and our responsibilities to future generations, and our responsibility to a higher power. Long before the Ten Commandments, before the patriarchs and the prophets, God spoke to his unique creations, Adam and Eve, and said, "Go forth, multiply, replenish the earth." The first commandment was procreation.
I've often said, what's a bit of a mouthful, on every measure measured within the U.S. Federal Survey System for adults and children, they thrive most in the intact married family that worship God weekly. Okay, let's unpack that because it's a bit of a much. The U.S. Federal Survey System is a huge boon to all of mankind because it's the only country in the world where we have lots of surveys. We have 14 federal surveys that analyze both the family structure and the frequency of religious worship. And it's as a result of that we can see natural law playing out. Well, we're looking now at the combined scores of math and English for American children between grades 7 to 12. And this is one of the first pieces of data I saw of the impact of religious worship on education performance. And the first time I graphed it, I almost fell off my chair because it was one of the first impacts I'd seen in my history of the data really showing this. And here you see it. American kids, this is a picture of America, of American teenagers. Those who worship weekly are the ones who are doing best on average. A couple of times a month, a couple of times a year, never, just like that. The impact of this in education is phenomenal. It is the great unknown in education. It's the great suppressed data in education. Every teacher, every school principal, every college president, every secretary of education at the state level and at the federal level should be deeply imbued with this data.
Religion instruction on a weekly basis is a huge factor in the development of a child. The family provides the safety net for the most vulnerable of society, both the young and the old. And given that children is the lifeblood and the human capital that's needed for a country's continued growth and economic prosperity, and given that the family really should be given special protection by the state, if they really want to see their nation prosper, it is my hope that we can really work together in helping to elevate the value that society places on motherhood, children, marriage, and faith in society. Why? Because families really do matter. Thank you.